Hi, hello. This is week 3 lecture for CGS 4375, Organized Crime. This week, you're assigned in the textbook to read chapters. Chapter 5 on Organized Crime in America, covering such topics as criminal history of Al Capone, the Valentine's Day Massacre, the Capone Chicago outfit, the city bosses, and whatnot. Pay particular attention to discussions in the textbook about the city bosses. There will be a question on the midterm specifically about the city bosses, and where you'll be asked to talk about the importance of the city boss and compare and contrast three of the various city bosses talked about in the textbook. So, kind of make notes of those things while you're reading Chapter 5 this week. And then Chapter 6 is also covered this week, Vice Prohibition in America, and that is what I want to use for my focus in this week's lecture. And really the most obvious place to start to talk about Vice Prohibition in America is talking about the Volstead Act, passed in 1920. When we talk about the Volstead Act, just a little background, prohibition, a prohibition in law prohibiting alcohol had long been the goal of the temperance movement. And it began life as a proposal by Minnesota Senator Andrew Volstead, which is why it's called the Volstead Act. Introduced into Congress on May 27th in 1919, adopted into law October 10th, 1919. The Volstead Act prohibited manufacture, sale, bartering, importing, exporting, delivery, furnishing, and the possession of intoxicating liquors, but left exceptions for industrial alcohol, sacramental wine, flavoring extracts, and medical prescription. Act was ratified by the states January 17th of 1919 and took effect 12 months later. The initial enforcement of the prohibition was largely handled at the state level. It was, with the act being largely handled at the state and local level, and the reality was the states and local police law enforcement was more concerned with trying to control the organized crime and the violence that arose because of the Volstead Act. They were much more concerned about that than they were actually enforcing the Volstead Act itself. Policing of the Volstead Act at the federal level was placed by President Harding under the Department of the Treasury, which utilized three particular agencies, the IRS, the Customs Department, and the Coast Guard, with enforcing prohibition. But it wasn't really a major emphasis of the Harding administration, and the federal government just put very little money into enforcing prohibition. And the reality is, if for everything the Harding administration put into it, the Coolidge administration did even less. And so what you see is an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a federal act prohibiting the sale and possession, transportation, what have you, of alcohol, and then they just left it up to the states to enforce it, and the feds really didn't put any emphasis on it. We see two presidential administrations pay hardly any attention to it at all, and so you see the first real reason why the Volstead Act was a failure. Why the prohibition really did not just created opportunity for organized crime in that here's another vice, here's another wanted product that the public wants that the mafia and the outfit and other organized crime organizations can provide, but you also find that with the federal government not putting a lot of force behind it, it expands the opportunity for organized crime because the mobsters and the mafiosi are thinking federal government passed this law, they don't care. And so now we have this great opportunity with very little risk, and really the majority of the risk during the Harding and the Coolidge administrations to the mafia was not from law enforcement per se, but really from other organized crime groups competing for sales territory. At the local level, enforcement was sporadic. It was uneven. There were states such as New Jersey, cities such as New York, Chicago, San Francisco that refused to enforce the law. By 1927, only 18 of the 48 states were spending any kind of money on enforcing prohibition. Well, I said they were spending a lot of money trying to combat the crime and the violence that came about it, but they weren't doing anything to actually enforce the Volstead Act itself. President Coolidge went so far as in 1929 he appointed a woman named Maribel Wildebrandt in charge of federal enforcement of the Volstead Act. At the time, to put a woman in charge of the enforcement of the federal law was kind of an ultimate form of insult. President Coolidge declared the enforcement of the Volstead Act to be a farce because of the lack of money and the widespread corruption brought about by it. And by the early 1930s, people realized that alcohol was coming into the country across every border, and the bootlegging and the other things that were empowered, that came along with it, were actually empowering the mafia. We didn't really see, it was not until 1928 that we saw a real attempt at enforcing it with the Hoover administration. But by the time the Hoover administration got the federal government involved in enforcing the Volstead Act, it was far too late. Organized crime, the mafia, and other organized crime groups had such a foothold, had such a business going on, that the public was not ready to put their support behind the Hoover administration's attempts to enforce it. People were depressed and they wanted to drink. This was during the Great Depression. In fact, it was such an unpopular. The Volstead Act by the 1930s was so unpopular that Franklin Roosevelt actually made the repeal of prohibition part of his election platform, and a month after taking office, he put together proposed legislation to repeal the 18th Amendment. The 21st Amendment was ratified in 1933, and thus ended federal prohibition. Now understand, some states held on to their prohibition laws for several years to come, but national prohibition was over by 1933. The sad truth is, however, that by the time the Hoover got around to enforcing it, and then by the time Roosevelt got into office and just got rid of it, prohibition had already done its damage. The organized crime groups, the mafia in America, had already made so much money and had gained so many inroads into local politics and state level politics that by the time prohibition was gone, the damage had already been done. And in many cases the damage was severe enough to be irrevocable. One of the crimes that became very popular during Prohibition, of course, was bootlegging. Bootlegging is, to define it, is the attempt to avoid paying taxes on a manufactured alcohol. Could be other products as well. Understand that bootlegging is a very old crime. In 1768, John Hancock's ship Liberty was seized by the British government, by the British Navy, because he was smuggling to avoid British taxes on certain products. After the American Revolution, the American government put a heavy tax on alcohol and it was one of the ways that we attempted to pay for the revolution was taxing alcohol. And so we saw a lot of Scotch-Irish bootleggers making their own booze and selling it to avoid paying the taxes. Uh, why did Prohibition create such great opportunity for the mafia? I give you 5 reasons. First, it was a desired product. Prohibition created instantly for the mafia, created a new product that was highly sought after by the public, and it instantly came with customers. In particular, we talk about middle and upper class folks. Really provided a great opportunity for the mafia because they were unwilling to settle for homemade brew. I mean, when you were in the lower class, you made a still and made your own booze. The problem was there was a lot of deaths involved. In 1920, there were at least 1,000 deaths related to illegal booze in poisoning that came with the processing of illegal hooch. And so the mafia Prohibition created for the mafia an opportunity for smuggling and bootlegging, transportation of booze out of Canada across the Great Lakes. Prohibition also created for the mafia opportunities in transportation and storage facilities. Not only does the mafia at the time make and sell the booze, but they controlled the trucking companies that shipped it. They controlled the ships that brought it over the Great Lakes from Canada. They controlled the warehouses where it was stored when it came over the border from Canada. Keep in mind, remember from, we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, when the mafia monopolizes a business, they're not just monopolizing the sale of a product. They're going to monopolize the production, the transportation, the retail sales. They're going to get everything, and they certainly did this with alcohol and Prohibition. They control production in the lower class neighborhoods. What the mafiosi, the wise guys would do is they'd go around their neighborhood, and for $2, they would sell home brew kits to everyone in the neighborhood. And then, once every couple of weeks, once a month, they would come back around and buy the booze that was made in the home brewery kits from the people in the neighborhood. Made this very frustrating for law enforcement because you'd go into a neighborhood and everybody was making alcohol, and all the wise guys did was they just came along and bought it up and then resold it in the speakeasies. Speaking of the speakeasies, the other source of opportunity for the mafia, a third source of opportunity for the mafia created by Prohibition, was in distribution networks. In particular, purchasing and operating speakeasies and other places where the alcohol was sold. Then also, a fourth list, they control the retail sales outlets, again, the speakeasies. And a fifth opportunity created by Prohibition for the mob was it gave the various families an excuse to cooperate. It actually brought these different groups together and tied them together closer. Didn't spell well for law enforcement. When we talk about Prohibition, it provided great growth for organized crime, particularly smuggling booze across the Canadian border. Even after the amendment was repealed, like I said, it was a little too late. Bootlegging continued. In fact, for those of you who are NASCAR fans, you should know that most of the early NASCAR drivers were bootleggers. Particularly one of the early stars of NASCAR. I'm not a NASCAR guy, but I understand one of the early stars of NASCAR was a guy named Junior Johnson. Junior was a very well-known bootlegger. and many of those early NASCAR folks. Um, that's what they did, how they paid for their cars, what they did when they weren't racing, was they were bootlegging illegal moonshine. All right, move away from alcohol and prohibition. The next thing I want to touch on is prostitution, another vice, um, and the mafia gets involved in. Keep in mind, prostitution not always a crime in the United States, and often considered more of a public health issue than a crime. But even where it's been illegal, it's often tolerated or controlled by the police. Um, much like drugs today and illegal gambling, sometimes the goal of law enforcement is not eradication, but rather containment. And certainly with prostitution, what you see law enforcement doing is just trying to shuffle the prostitution into red light districts into certain areas of town so that at least it's contained. Keep it away, keep it out of the areas where the voters live. When we talk about the history of prostitution with the mob, really by the 1930s, what you saw was the mob really didn't directly deal with prostitutes, but rather than dealing with prostitution itself, the mafia was more interested in collecting protection money from brothels. For instance, Colosimo, Torrio, and Capone in the 1920s Chicago did protection for prostitutes. But Torrio and Capone and Colosimo were some of the first mobsters to really get into prostitution. What they did was they operated hotels disguised as brothels. Public tolerance of prostitution really led to the formation of syndicates like the Independent Benevolent Association, the IBA, which was basically a syndication, a gathering of local politicians, real estate agents, saloon and brothel owners that got together to manage prostitution in various cities. The advantage of organizations like the IBA was that there was very little violence involved in prostitution. And prostitutes basically just paid protection money to this Independent Benevolent Association. Related to prostitution is the idea of pornography. It is, for the mafia, another source of income. Particularly because it is mostly for a lot of cases a cash business, which of course creates opportunities for money laundering. What you see is the mafia very heavily involved in the production and distribution of pornography. Often you'll see organized crime groups will require pornography producers to distribute their product through organized crime outlets rather than through legitimate outcomes. And you see that enforced through burglary the burglary and destruction of property of retail outlets of pornography. You see a lot of piracy of pornography being done by the mafia. Probably one of the more scary things we talk about prostitution and pornography and its relation to the mafia, is something we call white slavery. And here we'd be talking about human trafficking. What is, and you can read the textbook on this, probably the hardest thing to do is defining what white slavery is. Some would call it compulsory prostitution. Some would call it forcing people into labor for low wages, bad conditions. White slavery may just simply refer to those people who provide the workers. Uh, Probably the first government attention given to the White Slave Act was the Mann Act, M-A-N-N, Mann Act. This was the brainchild of Illinois Representative James Mann, um, who was the chair of the House Committee on Foreign and Interstate Commerce. He produced this bill to combat the trafficking of white girls. Some thought, like the representative from Alabama, that the Mann Act would uh, open the door towards the legislation of morality, which made the Mann Act a difficult act to sell. But you get the proponents of the act suggested that white slavery was actually worse than slavery in the South. Not my words. Because it claimed it was more degrading. Again, not sure I agree, but that was what proponents of the act would say. It became, while it was a tough bill to sell, it was also a tough bill to criticize because, you say, well, we're fighting the trafficking of illegal, trafficking of women illegally. And so even those people that stood against it, like the senator from Alabama at the time, very few had the bravery to stand up against the Mann Act. Signed into law June of 1910 by President Taft. The Mann Act says that any person who lawfully transports in interstate commerce any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution, debauchery, or other immoral purpose, with the intent to induce, entice, or compel such a woman or girl to become a prostitute, or give herself up for debauchery or other immoral practice. When this act was passed, the people that passed it insisted it was the only thing this bill was about, was limiting white slavery. But the problem with it was this act was so vague when it talks about enticing a girl to give herself up for debauchery or immoral act. Transporting the girl for the purpose of debauchery or immoral purpose. Very vague. Could be just about anything. In 1930, to give you an example, in 1913, the Baptist Convention wrote that this was a great law, that it is increasingly needed in the work of protecting our youth and our homes against social evil. By 1914, there were only 75 convictions for white slavery. Most of them, however, most of the convictions from the Mann Act instead came for fornication, adultery, men transporting perfectly willing women across state borders for prostitution and other purposes. For those of you that like the old movie from the 70s, Smokey and the Bandit, the bandit picks up the female lead in the movie, picks her up in the car as they go by and accuses that cross state lines for immoral purpose. The Sheriff Buford T. Justice. That's the Mann Act. Watch the movie. Yeah, you'll love it. Especially like car chases. It's an hour and a half car chase. Anyway, in 1917, in Conetti versus the United States, we see the Supreme Court expand the intent of the Mann Act. Basically, what had happened was Conetti, a state congressman, had crossed the border from California to Nevada with his mistress. And the idea was, it was found out this one was his mistress. It was a little embarrassing. They were going across state lines. But since he was married to someone else, they said, well, this is crossing a state line for an immoral act. And they convicted him, sentenced him to 18 months. And the Supreme Court upheld his conviction. And so basically the Supreme Court said, we're going to expand the intent of the act, which is the Mann Act, to prevent immoral behavior. With this broad interpretation, enforcement increased. Over the next 6 years, we saw 50,000 arrests. But sentences ranged from $50 fines to 5 years. It was largely used to deal with undesirables. But the Mann Act is particularly important because One, it is our first attempt to deal with human trafficking, but also because it's what gave the FBI, or at the time the Bureau of Investigation, it's something to do. When the Bureau of Investigation was originally put together, it had all of 6 agents. And, they had very few things they could actually do. Understand the Constitution does not really have a law enforcement power in it. The Mann Act was really the first federal act that gave the Bureau of Investigation, this agency that became the FBI, something to do. And it greatly expanded not just the power of the FBI, but you saw a great expansion in the number of agents and the number of field offices. But as long as we're talking about the Mann Act and human trafficking, let me talk a little bit about human trafficking. According to the United States, the U.S. State Department, 12.3 million people annually are placed into forced labor, bonded labor, or forced into prostitution worldwide. 12.3 million. In 2009, there were only 4,166 successful prosecutions of human trafficking. For prosecutions of forced labor, only 355. This is disturbing considering the number of people trafficked. Again, 12.3 million. That's depressingly scary, I think. What is human trafficking? We get away from the Mann Act and its definitions. According to the U.S. State Department, I'll just read this to you. Human trafficking is trafficking in persons as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other means of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or the position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person, for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others, or for other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. Ugh, what a complicated and ugly definition. Let me give you some major forms of trafficking in human persons, or things we do with trafficked people. Things the criminals do with trafficked people. First and foremost is forced labor. I bet you thought I was going to say something else when I said first and foremost. Most human trafficking involves forced labor. For every 1 individual forced into the sex trade, another 9 are forced into forced labor. This can also be known as involuntary servitude. Forced labor results when unscrupulous employers exploit workers made more vulnerable by high rates of unemployment, poverty, crime, discrimination, corruption, political conflict, or cultural acceptance. This also includes forced child labor. Another type of trafficking involves, of course, sex trafficking. You knew this one was coming. Sex trafficking can occur within debt bondage, as women and girls are forced to continue in prostitution through the use of an unlawful debt, purposefully incurred through their transportation, recruitment, or even their crude sale, which exploiters insist they must pay off before they can be free. So basically you get someone from Eastern Europe or Asia. They want to come to the United States. You say, okay, well, we'll pay all the costs for you to come to the United States. You just got to work off the debt on your back, so to speak, and the debt just never seems to get paid off. Another one of the major forms of trafficking includes bonded labor. This is where workers fall victim to what's called debt bondage. This is where traffickers or recruiters unlawfully exploit an initial debt the worker assumes as part of the terms of their employment. So maybe if I'm a trafficker, I bring you into the country and say, I offer you this wonderful new job in another country. And the agreement is I'll pay all your moving expenses and all your immigration expenses, and I'll handle all your legal bills for you. And just through the course of your employment, you'll pay that off. And as long, and you just agree to work for me until you've paid off the debt. And then through various means, I just make sure that you can never pay off the debt. Let's see. There's also involuntary domestic servitude. This is a unique form of forced labor. Involves the involuntary servitude of domestic workers. This is a place where the workplace is informal. This is often connected to off-duty living quarters. So you bring in a live-in maid from another country, and then you isolate them socially. You control their immigration paperwork. You basically just keep them away from, you bring them to America, and then they stay in your house. You isolate them socially, you isolate them financially, you control their visa, you control another immigration paperwork, and so you control their lives. And then you can always hold over their head the threat of, well, if you don't do what I say, I'll have you deported. I found a couple of stories examples of human trafficking. And these are just kind of news articles I'll read to you. The first one comes from Arlington in February of 2010. In Arlington, Texas, and these are the examples are, if you don't think these things happen in Texas, examples. February 2010, Arlington, Texas, a couple was convicted on federal charges of conspiracy to commit forced labor. Forced labor, conspiracy to harbor an alien for financial gain, harboring an alien for financial gain, document servitude, and making false statements to an FBI agent. The couple forced a Nigerian widow to perform domestic labor for more than 8 years after getting her to the United States by promising her that her children would be cared for in Nigeria if she worked in the United States. Once she arrived in Texas, the traffickers confiscated the victim's passport and forced her to work night and day. She was paid $300 over 8 years, and she was sexually assaulted by her male trafficker. In June 2010, the husband was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His wife got 9. September 2010, El Paso. 2 individuals were indicted on trafficking charges after forcing a woman and her 3 children, ages 7, 10, and 15, into domestic servitude. The family was smuggled into El Paso through a tunnel under the U.S.-Mexican border. Once they arrived in the United States, the victims were forced to cook, clean, and maintain the traffickers' safe house for approximately 3 months, purportedly to satisfy the debt they owed to the smugglers. Although the traffickers have fled the country, the El Paso District Attorney is working with the Justice Department and the State Department to return them to the United States to face charges. And finally, also in September of 2010, in Mission, Texas, a Mission bar owner was convicted of 3 counts of sex trafficking and conspiracy and 6 counts of harboring illegal aliens. The defendant in the federal case lured 3 Honduran minors to the United States with a promise of highly paid restaurant work at the bar El Palacio in Mission, Texas. Once they arrived, the girls were forced to pay their smuggling debts by selling drinks and having sex with customers. The defendant faces a minimum of 15 years in prison for each sex trafficking count, and up to 10 years in prison for the charges of harboring illegal immigrants. At the time of this report, he was awaiting sentencing. The Texas Alcohol Beverage Commission revoked the bar's license shortly after the arrest, and 4 others have pled guilty in connection with the charges. It happens in Texas, people. Who are these victims? Who is trafficked? Victims of trafficking are those people who are made vulnerable based on a number of characteristics, the first of which is age. Children are uniquely vulnerable to human trafficking because they are susceptible to the demands and expectations of people in authority, such as parents, extended family, teachers. Plus, children are just less able to physically protect themselves and are unaware of the laws designed to protect them. Secondly, you have gender. Women are more vulnerable because of their exclusion from mainstream economic and social systems in many places around the world. Such as employment, higher education. Women in many parts of the world are denied legal and political power, which makes them more vulnerable to human trafficking. A third characteristic is poverty. The lack of financial resources, limited education, health care leads to social discrimination, life in unsafe housing, um, makes people and put people in situations they want to get out of, which makes them vulnerable to the recruiting techniques of the traffickers. Next is social and cultural exclusion. This is for people that don't fall into a preferred category in their home country. Tend to suffer discrimination in education, employment, access to social services, particularly health care, have limited access to resources, particularly in times of natural disaster, and lack political power. These socially excluded groups tend to come from cultural subgroups who are marginalized, usually based on ethnic or linguistic or religious differences, and this prevents them from receiving benefits and protections, again, making them vulnerable to trafficking. I've mentioned a couple of times limited education, which of course is another characteristic of victims of trafficking. Individuals with limited education or are illiterate, have fewer income generating opportunities, and they don't have the knowledge or the confidence to inquire about the terms or conditions of working conditions. And then finally, just some other generic conditions. There's political instability, war, and conflict. Sometimes it's the social or legal frameworks in a country that actually facilitate the trafficking. Refugees from war zones are particularly vulnerable to trafficking. How are people trafficked? Sometimes by force, usually by fraud. Victims for any one of these reasons that I talked about tend to get lured away from their family and friends by the promise of a better life, usually in another country. And the reality is, for traffickers, there is no shortage of victims. People are eager for higher paying jobs. They're eager to get out of war zones. They're hungry for opportunities of a better life somewhere else. Once they're picked out by the trafficker, they are often forced to do both legal and illegal work. Everything from prostitution to exotic dancing, street peddling, housekeeping, childcare, construction, landscaping. There's just a huge variety of things trafficked people end up being forced to do. People that are trafficked, how do you control them? Of course, they can be controlled through physical violence, beating, sexual assault, starvation. They're also controlled emotionally by being socially isolated. They may be psychologically abused. There are times where they're intentionally addicted to drugs. You might threaten their family members at home. You might control them financially through debt bondage. Escape for these people is extremely difficult because they are kind of invisible in the United States. Victims tend not to speak English. They're afraid to approach authorities because they don't want to be deported. They don't have any idea who to go to for help or even how to go about it. The traffickers themselves are often members of the victim's own ethnic or national community. They tend to be here legally. They maintain strong contacts with their home country. And maybe individuals who are fluent in English or in their native language and have some sort of good social or political status in their home country that helps them draw victims. Traffickers tend to be people from international crime syndicates with what some researchers call a diversified trafficking portfolio, and which basically means they don't just traffic people, they smuggle drugs and guns right along with the people and often use the same routes for all three things. You also have, as far as trafficking, you have what we call mom and pop family operations, folks that have extended family in both countries, and may lure victims by striking up romantic relationships. You have independently owned businesses with contractors or agents who provide laborers for menial jobs. And then finally, you have some individuals, such as diplomats or foreign business executives, who arrive with their servants and then provide their servants for other things. But probably the greatest, probably the scariest or the hardest thing to accept about human trafficking is that many times it is the governments involved that make it easy on organized crime to get involved. You often see a great deal of complicity in law enforcement when it comes to trafficking. There are, governments can facilitate human trafficking by imposing legal and administrative penalties on the victims, such as they do things like fine them or give them penalties or punishment for getting engaged in prostitution or for violating immigration law. Some countries do things like they have guest worker programs that give the sponsors or the employers an inordinate amount of power over their migrant workers' legal status and their basic freedoms, basically allowing the company to control the immigration status and the basic freedoms of the employers they bring into the employees they bring into the country. Many countries lack meaningful legal opportunities they lack meaningful legal alternatives for trafficked individuals. You have countries where their trade policies fail to safeguard against forced labor and labor exploitation. Some countries put up such barriers to citizenship that make it almost impossible for victims of human trafficking to gain legal citizenship or legal residency in their destination country. You see in some of these places where, for women, there's a lack of education, and where women are blocked from mainstream economic participation. So they become vulnerable to human trafficking because of government social policy towards women. Even actual law enforcement activity. When the anti-trafficking activities of law enforcement are poorly planned and conceived, things such as wholesale raids on brothel districts without any kind of initial investigation makes it easier for the trafficking of humans. Oh, let's see, what do I want to talk about next? That's such a depressing topic, isn't it? Let's talk about gambling. Yay, gambling. Illegal gambling is... You know what? I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to stop here, make this part 1, and then in part 2, I'll talk about gambling, and we'll talk about the drug trade. And then we'll have both parts of the video for this week.